Hi everyone, this is Destiny from the Book Clinic. According to some statistics, 80% of Americans want to write a book in their lifetime. Yet, the vast majority of these people will never even try. Maybe you're one of those people. Maybe you have a fantastic idea for a story, but you don't even know where to begin. In this video, I'm going to break down the process of writing a book from start to finish. Now, the first step to writing a book is, of course, choosing an idea. This step is a little bit more complicated than it sounds. For one, you want to choose an idea that you can absolutely be passionate about for years to come. It could take you a month to write your book, or it could take you several years. You don't know. And I can't tell you how many authors burn out on a story 3 chapters in, or get halfway through only to completely lose interest and shelve the book forever. The second thing you should evaluate is whether this idea has room for expansion and development. Now, one of my favorite authors, Brandon Sanderson, says that a short story can run on one good idea. A good book needs several. So make sure the idea you choose isn't too narrow and has enough legs that you can write an entire book on. The third thing to evaluate is whether or not your idea is original. Now, I don't want you to stress too much about this, because almost everyone's first draft is at least somewhat derivative. And particularly if this is your first time writing a novel, then it's almost guaranteed that your book is going to contain some cliched elements. That's perfectly fine. There's nothing new under the sun, and it's impossible to make something that is completely and utterly unique. But you also want to make sure you're not writing a carbon copy version of someone else's work. Someone once told me that you should throw out the first idea that comes to mind, and the second, and the third. If something pops into your mind immediately, it's most likely because it's something that you've already seen many times before. Plots, tropes, cliches, and archetypes, they seep into our subconscious, and sometimes they can come through in your writing. So, as I said, don't stress too much about it, but do keep this in mind. If you do decide to go with an archetypical story, one that has been done many times before, and you've decided that that's what you want to do, this is the story that you want to write, then that's perfectly fine. Try to take the cliches and the tropes you're using and twist or subvert them in some way. Or if you really want to play the tropes straight, add depth and nuance to them. Even if you have the old wise mentor character that is so common in fantasy, give them some depth, make them 3-dimensional, and that will prevent your book from just seeming like one big cliche. Ideas are the foundations of your story, and after that, the hard work begins of building the story piece by piece. The second step is to nail the skeleton of your story. Now, I say the skeleton of your story very specifically because I don't think you necessarily need to plot out every single detail of your book. It's generally said that writers tend to fall or lean towards 2 different categories: pantsers or plotters, also called gardeners or architects. A gardener or a pantser tends to, write by the seat of their pants. They discovery write, making up the story as they go along. A plotter or an architect tends to be an outliner. They tend to write out pretty much everything that's going to happen in the story before they even write a single word of the first chapter. This seems like a dichotomy, but in actuality, it's a spectrum. And most writers will fall somewhere in between those two, leaning more to one side or the other. Now let's talk about the pitfalls that come with both these different types and styles of writing. Plotters sometimes have the problem of over-outlining, where they've outlined in such detail that they lose enthusiasm for the story, and then they don't feel like writing it. Others have what we call world builder's disease, which is when they spend so much time coming up with their world building and their setting and their characters and everything else that they never actually start writing the story. They spend 10 years building a world and no time actually writing. Another thing for plotters to look out for is that you're not going to be able to plan everything. Stories are almost like living things. They shift and evolve with time. You might find that your subplot isn't working and needs to be cut. You might find that you thought a character was going to have one arc, but as you write, you discover that it would make more sense to go in a different direction. You might get all the way to the end and find that your ending, despite it sounding great in the outline, actually doesn't land well when written on the page. You have to be willing to adapt to these circumstances and adapt to the way your story is changing as you're writing it. So even if you write super detailed scene-level outlines, keep in mind as you go along that your plans may change, and that's okay. It's nothing to be afraid of, and it's completely part of the process. But don't get me wrong, pantsers also have their own pitfalls. Structure is absolutely necessary for a story to sing, and a lot of pantsers don't quite realize that. I personally started off as a pantser, discovery writing pretty much my entire novel. But as a result, it took me a lot longer to shape my novel into what I want it to be. Years and years of revising. This is why, even if you're a pantser, I recommend you nail the skeleton of your story before you begin writing. This doesn't mean you have to outline in much detail, but it just means that you should know the basic elements of the story before you start. There are certain core components a novel needs in order to work, and it's worth figuring these things out beforehand. These essential components are the protagonist's character arc, the conflict, the stakes, and the setting. Let's dive into those in more detail. First, you want to design your point of view character. I can't emphasize enough how important the protagonist is to the success of your story. The protagonist is the one that the reader is connecting to, the gateway through which they enter your world. And if they can't sympathize with or connect with the protagonist, they're not going to care about the story as a whole. Choose your protagonist carefully. I'm a big fan of Kay M. Weiland. She writes great books on the craft of storytelling. And she says on her blog that the POV character should be the one with either the most to gain or the most to lose. This is because the protagonist should be the one that's driving the story forward. They should be an active force in the plot. The protagonist should be proactive but relatable, flawed but with room to grow. Once you nail down the basic details of a character, figure out what their arc is going to be. Your character should grow, evolve, and change over the story, becoming either a better or a worse person by the end. Decide what flaw is hindering your protagonist's progress and how they overcome that flaw by the end. I have a blog post on my website, bookclinicnyc.com, where I go in detail on how to create a compelling protagonist. So if you need more help, I recommend going there. I also highly recommend Kay M. Weiland's book, Creating Character Arcs. It will change the way you approach designing characters for the better. As Stephen King says, put interesting characters in difficult situations and write to find out what happens. The conflict could be anything: a family feud, a love triangle, someone's dog running away. It's up to you. But the important thing to remember is no matter what, the conflict needs to be tied to the protagonist and their desire. Screenwriter Aaron Sorkin puts it perfectly. He says, somebody wants something, and something is standing in their way of getting it. They want the money. They want the girl. They want to get to Philadelphia. Then the obstacle to that has to be formidable, and the tactics they use to overcome that obstacle are what shows us the character. So once you have the conflict in mind, decide what the stakes are going to be. Stakes are basically the reason why the reader or viewer should care what's happening. What is the protagonist risking by embarking on their journey? And what happens if they don't succeed? Now, if you're a pantser, you probably don't want to outline your plot scene by scene. That's perfectly fine, but I do suggest you come up with the inciting incident and the climax. The inciting incident is, as John York puts it, the catalyst for the character's desire. This is the moment where the plot runs into the protagonist like a freight train and takes them on a wild ride. It is essentially the moment of no return for your character. The conflict, on the other hand, is the absolute peak of the action and tension. It's the all or nothing moment where the conflict reaches a crescendo. Often, it's a battle between the protagonist and the antagonist. The inciting incident and the climax are what create the arc of the story. Now, some people will tell you not to come up with the climax or the ending before you start writing, that you'll figure it out as you go along. I do think it's worthwhile to come up with the climax. It makes sure you're writing towards something instead of writing aimlessly. You're heading for a destination, and now all you have to do is figure out the journey. After you solidify the skeleton of your story, it's time to do some research. Figure out what has been done before and how it's been done. I personally believe it's nearly impossible for someone to be a really good writer if they don't read voraciously. Read every book in your genre that you can get your hands on. Analyze the stories for what they did well and what they could have done differently. If a book contains a trope, a character, a plot line that is similar to yours, see how they went about doing it and whether or not it was satisfying. And if not, how you can make sure you don't fall into the same trap when writing your story. Dissect the novels not just for whether or not they're entertaining, but exactly how each element of the book functions. What is the purpose of that plot twist? How did that particular setback alter the main character's development? This will help you be less cliche when writing your own novel, and you'll know how the tropes you're using have been handled before. Now that you've front-loaded the most important things, it's time to get down to business. Finally, it's time to write. Don't stress about how long the book should be or how many chapters are or whether or not your chapters are equally spaced. Don't worry about any of that stuff. Editing, formatting, nothing. Your only goal should be to get the words down on the page. Don't expect the first draft to be anywhere near perfect, and please, for the love of God, don't start editing until you're finished. Writing a book is like sculpting a statue. The first pass, the goal is to just make this lump of stone into something that vaguely resembles a human. Every pass, the sculptor chips away until the block of stone actually looks like a human being. Writing is the same way. The first pass will only get you the vague shape of a novel. Then it's time to revise. The last step to writing a book is to revise. At the end of the day, revision is what makes a novel. And this is what a lot of people don't want to hear. This is the work. Rewriting the book, maybe from scratch, or editing extensively. As you're writing, you're likely to find problems with character arcs, with pacing, with tension, with prose. After you finish the first draft, put it aside for a little while, a week or two at the very least. If you know the story isn't working but you don't know how to fix it, consider giving it to some friends or hiring a professional editor to tell you exactly what's wrong. This is why I'm always encouraging writers to study their craft. Read books on writing and storytelling so that you can understand the mechanics of a story. When you're trained to critically analyze a work, you can tell what's not working and why it isn't working. But you may ask, after editing and revising to death, how do you know that your novel is done? You'll know it's done when you've done absolutely everything you can to make the story as strong as it possibly can be. Then it's either time to hire a cover designer and editor so you can self-publish or to start querying. As you can see, there is a lot that goes into writing a novel. But I think it's one of the most fulfilling, rewarding things you can possibly do. So if you've had a story idea bouncing around in your head forever, but you haven't had the confidence or the know-how to actually start writing, I hope this encourages you to put pen to paper and get started. Happy writing.